I'm Louise Shelley. I'm the director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center. And I want to welcome you today to Jacob Zenn's presentation on Boko Haram. We're very fortunate to have him. He's an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University's Security Studies program and a senior fellow on African and Eurasian affairs at the Jamestown Foundation. He also holds a JD from Georgetown Law. But what is of particular interest to us is the field work he has done in Borno State, Nigeria, in Niger, Cameroon, and Chad to map Boko Haram's organizational structure. He has a book called Unmasking Boko Haram, Exploring Global Jihad in Nigeria, and a recent article called Chronicling the Boko Haram Decade in Nigeria, 2010 to 2020, Distinguishing Factions through Videographic Analysis. And that was published very recently in Small Wars and Insurgencies. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Jacob. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Louise. And I'm really glad to be here. In fact, one of my last events before the pandemic set in was a conference in DC where I met with SWAT, who's one of your professors and the leaders of your organization. And since then, people haven't been able to meet together, but I'm happy to meet with all of you. And I'll start by just providing a brief background of myself. Now, as Louise mentioned, one of my latest articles chronicles Boko Haram's videos from 2010 to 2020 because the war really began in 2010. Now, how did I get involved with studying Boko Haram? Well, to make a long story short, I actually had been studying Swahili after I was studying Arabic in Yemen for a period of time when I finished college in 2005. And then when I moved to Washington, D.C. in 2008 to attend Georgetown Law, I began working part-time analytical jobs around DC related to the formation of AFRICOM, or Africa Command, which was set up around 2007. So I was assisting some organizations to begin proposals to AFRICOM for the type of work that they could do in Africa. And one of the proposals had to do with Nigeria's conflicts within its 36 states. And one of the areas I was already researching before 2010 was Nigeria's Borno State, which is in the far northeast near Lake Chad, and that's been the epicenter of Boko Haram. So just as this conflict beginning in 2009, I was already following events in Borno. And I think since the beginning, I've been observing the organization from the perspective of Borno into the Sahel and Central Africa and Sudan, and even toward the Middle East, as opposed to an Abuja or Lagos-centric perspective, where perhaps Nigerianists would have been focusing since the beginning. Now, we might come back to this year 2010 soon, and in the Q&A, which will be the last 20 minutes of our discussion, we can talk more about the ISIS affiliation, because there's so much to talk about in my initial 20-minute talk that I'm not even sure we'll get to ISIS, because there's really so much important stuff to talk about, even beyond what many people are interested today, which is, of course, ISIS. So let me go back to beginnings and link up the study of Boko Haram with different thematic areas of study for those of you who might be studying terrorism, but not necessarily the intricacies of Boko Haram. Is everything clear with my voice so far?
Perfect.
Great. So one question we can ask is, how do terrorist groups form, or specifically jihadist groups? And in the case of Boko Haram, my research, and you won't find this in a lot of other academic work, which is why I want to present it here, and you won't find it on Wikipedia or anything, no easy finds for this, but I argue that Boko Haram's origins are in 1994. And there's an important point I want to make when we study jihadism, insofar as Nigeria became independent in 1960. It had a legacy of Sharia law and an Islamic state in the pre-colonial era, which ended when it became colonized by Britain in the late 1800s, and neighboring parts of Nigeria were colonized by France. Now, when Nigeria became independent in 1960, there was a call to bring back the Sharia that existed in the pre-colonial era. And this is very similar to trends you'd see in the Middle East too, where the Ottoman Empire fell, and later people wanted to revive Sharia law after the period of colonialism. However, the idea after 1960 that you would wage a jihad in order to instill Sharia in Nigeria just didn't exist. Nobody assumed that jihad meant fighting to wage Sharia against a non-Islamic government. The two ways that Nigerian Muslims wanted to revive Sharia was one, through a Salafi way, which is largely inspired by the Saudi version of Wahhabism, where they wanted, but they were influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood as well. And if anyone studies the Saudi educational institutes like Islamic University of Medina, where many Nigerians studied, a lot of the teachers were actually Muslim Brotherhood members, even though that sort of conflicted with Wahhabi's exclusiveness. So the one method to instill Sharia in Nigeria was through imposing Wahhabi-like Sharia law in Nigeria, but through the political system, which is the Muslim Brotherhood approach. The other approach after 1979 was based on the Iranian Revolution of 1979, where Nigerian Shias said we need to engage in activism in order to encourage an Islamic revolution. The idea that you should fight jihad against the Nigerian government because it was non-denominational was only introduced in 1994. And how did this get introduced? Well, here we can look at terrorism networks and international connections. In 1992, in Algeria, there began a civil war. And this was because Islamists, who also included Afghan jihad veterans, including those who were funded by Osama bin Laden, who was then based in Sudan, began waging a military campaign against the Algerian government because it suppressed elections that would have led to Islamist governance in Algeria. Now, some of those Islamists, especially those who were tied to bin Laden, included an Afghan jihad veteran who moved from Algeria down to the Sahel in order to supply arms to the Algerians who were fighting against the government. When Algeria and France began informing Niger about the presence of GIA members, so that was the name of the group fighting Algeria at that time, the Armed Islamic Group, then the first members of the GIA went into Nigeria in 1994. And they linked up with Salafis there who supported the cause of the war in Algeria. And this is when the first recruitment of Nigerians to the GIA began. And the first Nigerians really began to engage in regional militancy. And one of these Nigerians who got caught up in this recruitment, amongst only several dozens, was someone named Muhammad Ali, who you will generally read about in the literature of Boko Haram. And he was a university leader. He ended up going to Sudan and Saudi Arabia, where his fathers had properties. And he began introducing jihadist concepts to his fellow university followers. And then this Muhammad Ali linked up with somebody named Muhammad Yusuf, who's generally considered the Boko Haram founder in all the literature. And they formed a group which was then known as the Nigerian Taliban in 2002. And they differed from mainstream Salafis in that they introduced this idea that you need to wage jihad against the Nigerian government because it's non-Islamic. And that was very different from what Salafis had urged before, even though Salafis had been sympathetic to Al-Qaeda's cause. Now, when you also study terrorist groups, you'll also learn about how counterterrorism pressures can have unprecedented consequences. Now, one thing that happened in May 2003 was that Saudi Arabia itself was attacked by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. This led to a change in Saudi Arabia foreign policy, where it used to welcome support of Islamist militants around the world. After 2003, it began cracking down. When it became known by Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Nigerian intelligence that there were jihadists associated with Al-Qaeda in Nigerian territory, albeit only about 100 of them, it led to a crackdown on these jihadists in December 2003. And this was reported by BBC at the time, and it's known as the Kanama affair, because the Nigerian government cracked down on a group in Kanama village, Yobe state, near the Nigeria-Niger border, and killed this individual, Muhammad Ali, who was basically the first jihadist in Nigerian history, and some of his followers. And this group that was then known as the Nigerian Taliban, because they idolized the Taliban and some had actually close ties to Al-Qaeda, was believed to be destroyed. Okay, so one of the unprecedented consequences was that Muhammad Ali's colleague, Muhammad Yusuf, who was a local Nigerian preacher who had never really left the country except for pilgrimage, he fled to Saudi Arabia in 2004. There, Nigerian Salafis met with him, and they explained to him, like, we are no longer for jihad. We know that we had issued pro-Bin Laden statements after 9/11, but we don't want jihad in Nigeria. I argue that their turn against jihadism after flirtations with it after 9/11 was partly due to the fact that leading Nigerian Salafis, almost all of them studied in Medina, in Saudi Arabia. And so when Saudi Arabia's policy got changed to be against jihadism, Nigerian Salafis who wavered then became against it. So they told this one individual, Muhammad Yusuf, who had been the colleague of Muhammad Ali, who was the first jihadist, they said, come back to Nigeria, but let's not preach jihad anymore. Muhammad Yusuf basically did not oblige them. Muhammad Yusuf was not quite like them. He was not an elite. He was not trained in Saudi Arabia. And he continued to urge for jihad, but through the concept of dawah, or preaching, which is similar to what you saw after the Arab Spring in countries like Tunisia, where they had a group called Ansaru. You also saw this in Yemen after the Arab Spring with a group called Ansaru there, where Al-Qaeda or jihadi groups try to disassociate them slightly from jihadism through preaching, but really they have, say, the same ideology. So that's what Muhammad Yusuf did from 2004 to 2009. And here, conceptually, we get into the challenge of the concept of extremism. And the reason why that we get into that challenge is that, Muhammad Yusuf is often portrayed as an extremist during this period from 2004 to 2009. Now, his argument was simple to Nigerian Muslims. He said, look, we live in Nigeria. This is not an Islamic state. If we do live in an Islamic state guided by the Sharia, then we will be more moral, we will be more prosperous, and we'll be more faithful to our religion. Nigerian Salafis countered and said, look, we acknowledge Nigeria is not an Islamic state. We do not rule by the Sharia. We have a constitution, but we as Muslims are free to practice our religion in the complete way. We can go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. We can pray 5 times a day. We can establish mosques. Women can wear Islamic clothing. Men can even have 4 wives if they want. There was nothing prohibiting Muslims from fulfilling their obligations, so they accepted the legitimacy of the Nigerian state on that grounds. And Muhammad Yusuf said, no, we don't accept that. And this led to the schism between Muhammad Yusuf's followership, which we now call Boko Haram, but at that time was called either Yusufiyya or the Nigerian Taliban, and the mainstream Nigerian Salafis. And the reality is that a lot of people were convinced by what Muhammad Yusuf was saying at that time. And Muhammad Yusuf added something to his equation. He said, because of the popularity of our preaching, which you might also attribute to poverty and marginalization and the fact that Nigeria was not run well, that made people want to seek this alternative. But he said, we're gaining popularity, and eventually the government is going to crack down upon us and kill us. And therefore, we always need to be psychologically prepared for jihad, because this will eventually happen. This is what he told his followers. And journalists at the time noted that Muhammad Yusuf was gaining popularity, and that if Nigeria didn't stop him, he was going to be more popular than the government and be able to seize power in Borno State, Nigeria, just based on his popularity, his charismatic preaching, and his message. People were convinced by what he was saying. And Yusuf was right. By 2009, again, due to some intelligence pressure on Nigeria, including from the United States, about Nigerians who were training in Somalia, as well as Nigerian concerns about Yusuf's rise, they basically killed him and 200 people. And this was now the internet era, and it got portrayed on YouTube and whatnot. And that was something that Nigeria probably didn't expect. And Muhammad Yusuf became a big martyr. They thought killing him would end the group, just as they thought killing Muhammad Ali in 2003, 2004 would kill that group. But that didn't quite happen. And here we can, I have 5 minutes left in this initial portion before the Q&A. And so after 2009, they thought this group was done. We killed Muhammad Yusuf, the idea is done. Yusuf was clever enough, though, that he had some followers who had already established contacts with Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, by the mid-2000s. And they immediately brought Muhammad Yusuf's followers to AQIM training camps in the Sahel, where they learned intense skills like creating bombs that they were not accustomed to doing in Nigeria because they didn't have the operational space or expertise. So by 2010, Yusuf's deputy, Abu Bakr Shekau, became the new leader. He announced his leadership on jihadist forums, because now Boko Haram was integrated into the global jihadist media apparatus. And the followers who had trained in the Sahel came back. Now here we get back into the issue of terrorist factionalization. One virus, you might say, in jihadi ideology is that there's this tendency to go very extreme. This happened in 1980s Afghanistan, it happened with the GIA in Algeria, it happened with ISIS in Syria, and it happened with Abu Bakr Shekau in Nigeria. He became as extreme as it gets in terms of jihadi ideology, labeling anybody who was not a member of his group as an infidel worthy of being killed. So it includes a lot of Muslims in addition to Christians. And arguably Muslims are worse because they're apostates, according to him. So when these Nigerians who had trained with AQIM came back to Nigeria and saw what Shekau was doing, they told AQIM, this guy's way beyond the scope of what Al-Qaeda even does. So Al-Qaeda approved a new faction to form by 2012, which is called Ansaru, which is short for Supporters of Muslims in Black Africa. So by 2012, you had two factions. The main faction of Shekau, whose name we'll just call Boko Haram, but their name is Jamestown Foundation and Global Jihad. It's very long. And Ansaru. So you had Shekau and Ansaru in 2012. And as you know from following jihadist groups around the world, what happened was Shekau basically tried to kill Ansaru and behead its members for opposing him, even though they brought skill to the group, especially suicide bombings and bombing craftsmanship and kidnapping craftsmanship. They kidnapped 10 foreign engineers in 2011, 2012. But Shekau killed them. He even told the Nigerian security forces about their location so the Nigerian security forces could kill them. And so that group became dormant, you could say. And Shekau led the main faction of Boko Haram, which is centered in Borno State. And as a result, actually, of destroying this other faction, the group's central Nigeria presence, where they targeted the Christians who live mostly in central Nigeria and southern Nigeria, ended, and the group became concentrated in Borno. Now, the last thing I'll mention in this opening talk, before we go into the Q&A, and I assume you might ask a question about ISIS there, and I can elaborate. The last thing I want to mention is that the group was waging urban warfare in Borno, mostly in cities, until 2013. However, Nigeria developed something called the Civilian Joint Task Force, where local vigilantes rose up against the group, similar to the Sahwa, or Awakening Councils in Iraq, against Abu Musa al-Zarqawi's Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So what Boko Haram did under Shekau there was they retreated to the countryside. Nigeria had very small, unprepared military posts in the countryside, and Boko Haram began raiding those military barracks by 2013. It caught the Nigerians totally off guard. So this was an unprecedented and unintended consequence of actually succeeding in pushing the group out of cities. But then the group went to the countryside. Moreover, some of the members who had trained in Mali or fought in other regional conflicts like Chad, they had experience with guerrilla warfare, and they brought that back to Boko Haram, and they began raiding Nigerian military barracks. And this is how by 2013, 2014, Boko Haram conquered territory. That led to the infamous Chibok kidnapping in April 2014, where Shekau announced the revival of slavery and took the Chibok schoolgirls, about 250 of them, and you probably heard about that. So this is when Boko Haram began conquering territory, and in just 4 years since the real war broke out in 2010, the group was now controlling, what is considered the size of Belgium or the state of Maryland in northeastern Nigeria. And then by 2015, the group joined ISIS. And that was a very complicated process with a lot of internal factions debating about it. And what you could say is this. Here's what I'll leave you with before we go into Q&A. Although all the Boko Haram members agreed that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was caliph when he announced his caliphacy in 2014, the members who used to be sympathetic with Al-Qaeda, and even in that Ansaru faction that I mentioned, they used the Pledge of Allegiance to ISIS in order to force Shekau to pledge loyalty to ISIS, in order to subsequently compel ISIS to drop Shekau from ISIS leadership as a way to dethrone him because they didn't like him so much. So they used internal politics in order to basically scam Shekau into pledging loyalty to ISIS in order to get ISIS to drop him. And that's why the group factionalized again in 2016 and Shekau was kicked out of ISIS. And that's also why Shekau did not really want to join ISIS in the first place, because he suspected that was going to happen, even though he acknowledged Baghdadi was caliph. And now we can talk about how the group has evolved since this big schism in 2016. I know it's all complicated, and I put it in my book, but what's important to understand is jihadi groups, even like companies in the real world, even like university departments sometimes, they're full of factionalization, but it's brutal and lethal and highly deceptive within jihadi organizations. So I hope that was stimulating. I hope I didn't talk too quickly, but that might leave us with some content for Q&A.
All right. Please put your questions in the question and answer box, or in, we have one. And I have one, but we'll start with a member of the database. What is the strategic importance of Takfir by Salafi jihadist groups?
Okay, so the strategic importance of Salafi jihadi groups?
Of Takfir.
Okay. Oh, of Takfir, yeah. So, okay, So I mean, takfir undergirds jihadi ideology, and that's perhaps the most important thing. This is where you label people who ostensibly are Muslims as non-Muslims, and you legitimize killing them. And the big question is, who do you label as Muslims who have apostatized? Now, ordinary Muslims anymore. You basically need to overtly blaspheme in order to apostatize in the regular world. But amongst Al-Qaeda, they would say basically anyone who collaborates with the government that doesn't rule by Sharia is probably an apostate and that you can kill. And ISIS took it a step further, and especially Abu Bakr Shekau, and said anyone who just does not join our group to wage jihad against those governments is an apostate. So if you're just an ordinary Muslim going about your business, don't support the government, you're still an apostate and you still can be killed simply for not supporting those who are trying to kill them. And this gets into the concept of chain takfir, where jihadi groups end up declaring takfir on virtually the entire society, because they will say, if this ordinary Muslim is an infidel because this ordinary Muslim is not fighting with us, and you don't declare this ordinary Muslim an infidel, then you yourself are an infidel. This is why some ISIS members even called al-Baghdadi an infidel, because they said al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, is an infidel for not pledging loyalty to al-Baghdadi. And then al-Baghdadi did not declare takfir on al-Zawahiri. So ISIS members said, well, that makes al-Baghdadi an infidel. So that is why it's very important to understand takfir ideology for jihadi groups. And that's why some people in Borno, Nigeria, will say there's so many innocent people who get killed and they don't understand why they're getting killed. It's because they don't comprehend that Boko Haram has introduced this new ideology of takfir that, again, did not exist amongst ordinary Salafis to the extent that it does under Boko Haram. And that's why they kill so many people and can justify it. And of course, there's difference even now between the factions, Shekau and the other faction, which I'll make sure to talk about at least a few minutes before this closes.
Okay, another question. Protests in Nigeria are calling for massive police reforms to bring an end to the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, SARS, and to police brutality in general. Do you think these protests will help in the fight against terrorism to put an end to human rights abuses, therefore ending the cyclical nature of violence? Or do you think that the protests have negative impacts that undermine the authority of the Nigerian state? And I want to add, wait a second, and I want to add something to that, in that this corruption in the police is also, I think, very crucial in mobilizing people, and I'd like you to comment on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. This is something I think American people can really understand. There are clear echoes of the protest movements in the US now and the protest movements in Nigeria. And I think part of that is because our societies are not only interlinked through, say, diaspora, but also through social media. Nigerians and Americans use English on social media mostly, and they hear what we say, we hear what they say. So you see slogans coming out of Nigeria now saying things like "End SARS," Special Anti-Robbery Squad, the special police. It's similar to when you hear "Abolish the police" in the US. You hear slogans like "Together we can." It's similar to "Yes we can." And you hear other slogans like "Remember their names" in Nigeria now, which is similar to "Say their names," which you hear in the US. And basically, if you ask what they're protesting in Nigeria, it's police brutality. So there's clear echoes of what we see here and what they're doing there. Now, the implications, I think, are twofold. One, it does make these protests show that the government has lost legitimacy. The government has not curbed the activities of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. And the people north and south in Nigeria know that. And on one level, when I talk about unintended consequences, this does add legitimacy to a claim of Boko Haram that the Nigerian government is fundamentally brutal and illegitimate. And this is partly why Muhammad Yusuf said originally, if you have Sharia and follow our model, we will promise you a more moral society. And it's very hard to say that the Nigerian government is offering a convincing model of a moral government. So that does leave an alternative to a group like Boko Haram that says, here, we have an alternative, whether you like it or not. At the same time, this is a chance for Nigeria's government to step it up and respond to the public outcry with accountability and create a more accountable police and efficient policing system, and to change the course that has existed with the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. Now, the question is whether the country's president, Muhammad Buhari, is up to the task Is he really monitoring this? Is he hearing the voices of, say, you know, the young people leading these protests? I don't know if I've heard those types of statements from him. Some local officials have done it. So I'm not sure if Nigeria is going to, you know, respond to the call in a very mature and accountable way. And if it does, then yes, I think it will be better for the country and for dampening the narratives that Boko Haram is making that Nigeria is illegitimate. But whether Nigeria will do that and can structurally do that in its government, which is known for its corruption, it is really questionable. So while there's laudable aims of the protests, I'm not sure if the government is going to respond accountably, unfortunately, but it's a key test.
Okay. Could you say a few words more on the corruption part of this and Boko Haram?
Yeah, so I mean, you can say that Nigeria, it is a country that benefited from the oil boom in the 1970s, and it became very wealthy and prosperous. It was expected to be the regional security guarantor in West Africa and to be, you know, a regional hegemon. That's what the country envisioned for itself. But what happened was that through various kinship, tribal, religious, patronage networks, government kleptocracy, the country being under military rule for a long time, the wealth never really transferred to the people in any way that was clear. It got kept with the elites and the power brokers. And I think everybody knows that. And this is something, what you might call resource curse. The country did not really benefit on the whole from the oil money. And that's why in the southern part of the country, in the mid-2000s, you saw Niger Delta militants rising up, basically saying, you're taking all the oil from our region and we're not getting anything. But their insurgency dampened by the end of the 2000s, in part because the warlords or the local leaders of that region were paid off by the government to calm that insurgency down. But really, the people still haven't benefited much from the oil boom there. And the same would go for the north, especially Borno, where Boko Haram exists. That's not only far from the oil-producing regions, but there was very insignificant results from the countries being wealthy. And that, again, helps the narratives of a group like Boko Haram that tells the people that the government is not accountable, the government doesn't care about you, we offer you another model based on the Sharia. So let's just say you would not be interested in the Sharia otherwise. The fact that the Nigerian government hasn't been accountable makes that other option, even Boko Haram's version of Sharia, simply more attractive by virtue of you finding that the government is not doing for you what it should.
Okay, we have a lot more questions here. So let me start with, there are two of them by Mahmoud Cengiz, who oversees the database. He's our professor on that. ISIS West Africa is using more hearts and minds policy in the region and selectively targeting state institutions and the military. However, Boko Haram is indiscriminate in its targets. What group, Boko Haram or ISIS West Africa, has more support and influence in the region among locals? How does Boko Haram differ from ISIS West Africa in terms of ideology and global networks? And then there's a little bit more on the media's reporting increased kidnapping and village raids in Northwest states by bandits. So we'll come to a question on bandits next, because we have a few on that.
Okay. In fact, this question, this answer will lead into that. So that's like a really important question. I didn't mention this in my initial talk because I figured in the Q&A we could. But as I mentioned, Shekau pledged loyalty to ISIS in 2015, and Boko Haram became ISIS West Africa Province, or ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP. I argue that Shekau was sort of compelled into it because the more moderate members of ISWAP eventually wanted to overthrow him, which they did in 2016. Shekau led the group until 2016. Then they kept on submitting to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and his people in Syria, reasons why Shekau was too insane to govern the group. And finally, ISIS pushed Shekau aside, and the more moderates took over ISWAP. Shekau formed Boko Haram again in its second iteration in 2016. So you have two factions, ISWAP and Boko Haram in 2016, and Ansaru, that Al-Qaeda one, was still sort of dormant in 2016. And yeah, initially ISWAP was moderate because it didn't like Shekau's extremism. And it you know, had, even though it was ISIS, it had a very Al-Qaeda-like interpretation of takfir. It said, we will attack the government and the military and anyone who collaborates with them. And from 2016 to 2018, that's what ISIS was like. and it had credibility from around the country, from Nigerians who wanted to follow the ISIS model, who saw what Baghdadi was doing on social media. And ISWAP captured Nigerian recruits from across the country. And it was also being able to train in Libya with ISIS. And it was becoming a very professional non-state military group, ISWAP, from 2016 to 2018. Not only was it very strong militarily, but it was also moderate. So it was winning the hearts and minds of the people. However, as I mentioned, jihadi groups are constantly have internal rivalries. And in 2018 to 2019, there was like an internal coup in ISWAP. And the hardliners, who were once close to Shekau, won that internal coup, and they pushed aside the moderates. So now it's not really that easy to say that ISWAP is still winning hearts and minds like it was. The hardliners are in control, and they've been effective very much military against the Nigerian military, and they've conducted massacres against civilians who collaborate with the military more than the group had done in like 2016 to 2017. But the military success of ISWAP during this time, around 2018, 2019, forced Nigeria's military to go into super camps, which are huge walled-off fortresses covering major towns. But they basically gave the countryside to ISWAP. So now ISWAP roams the countryside, and it's basically largely free there. And it's hard to know how it recruits there, but we can say that its major military tactic now is ambushing the roadways, kidnapping people, and now it also targets Christians, which the more moderate version of ISWAP didn't do, and it attacks aid workers. And by attacking aid workers, it can try to get money for their release, or it can just make life very difficult for Nigeria's military because it can't take care of all these people in displaced persons camps. Shekau, his faction, which is even more ruthless than ISWAP, is more bunkered down in southern Borno. It doesn't have very expansionist goals. It's more content to have its own territory, even if it can't be, very expansionist like ISWAP. Moreover, one consequence of ISWAP being attached to Islamic State is it needs to have a high tempo. Islamic State needs to see ISWAP carrying out attacks, claiming attacks, showing photos, and showing videos. It has that pressure. Shekau can afford to not do that because he's not part of ISWAP. And so he has his own territories in the south of Borno where they live their own Islamic lifestyle. And either way, even if these groups can't recruit, they have enough members, enough abductees, including women, enough of their own wives, they can actually create their next generation just by their own children in their group, in their territories, which is an important thing to look at. Now, just segueing into the bandit question, I'll just say that since 2019, 2020, nonetheless, both ISWAP and Boko Haram have recognized that there's a lot of money to make through banditry in the Northwest. And they both began establishing cells there where otherwise banditry groups roam. So if there's any other questions about banditry coming up, we can sort of talk about the interlinkages between banditry and ISWAP and Boko Haram and even Ansaru.
All right, we have a question from Matt there. You suggested that Muhammad Ali is the first jihadist leader in Nigerian history, and that Boko Haram's history goes back to the 1990s. What do you say about the movement of Muhammad Marwa, who is often presented as the master of Muhammad Yusuf? And second, historians agree that West Africa has recorded some jihadist movements in the 18th and 19th century, for example, with Usman Dan Fodio in northern Nigeria.
Great. So Muhammad Marwa, known as Maitatsini, the one who curses, he led a millenarian group in the 1980s, but it was very heterodox. Like he believed that, he had his own Quran and, that he was sort of his own prophet. And this was the turn of the century of Hijri Islamic calendar. So he thought that he was like the new coming of the prophet. So he resembles Boko Haram in a couple ways. One, he captured urban, poor immigrants to cities. And that same demographic became Muhammad Yusuf's followers. And he resembles Abu Bakr Shekau because he cursed everyone. He declared takfir on everyone. And that's what Abu Bakr Shekau does. So you can see his type of leadership rhyming. That's why he was called the one who damns. He was calling takfir on everybody. And in addition, Muhammad Yusuf's father and uncle were members of Maitatsine in one way or another. But one thing that's important to note is his power period was like 1970. By 1980, there was so much Salafi and Shia influence in Nigeria that there was no room for someone with such heterodox beliefs. So I would say that it's fair to say that Boko Haram mirrored Maitatsine, but in a new era of the 1980s or 1990s, where they now formalized his similar mindset, but in a more mainstream, Islamic approach, in the extent that they considered themselves part of mainstream Salafism, even though they ended up going too far into Takfirism, but they didn't have any of these quirky things. And Muhammad Yusuf cited Salafi scholars from Saudi Arabia, and they had a more typical approach. So that's relevant. On Usman Danfodio, he was the pre-colonial Islamic State founder or jihadist. And he is resonant in certain ways, but more amongst the Ansaru faction. Shekau's faction in Borno and even ISWAP in Borno are mostly Kanuris. The historical Kanuris fought against Usman Danfodio's caliphate because they didn't want it to come to Borno. Ansaru was partly a rebellion against Shekau, not only on ideological grounds, but also because Shekau was very Kanuri-centric. Ethnic cleavages formed. And so Ansaru was more Hausa and Fulani. And that's why Ansaru explicitly draws on Usman Danfodio in its narratives. And that's why when you talk about the Northwest and banditry now, Ansaru tries to revive these narratives in order to recruit Fulani bandits. And that makes it a little bit harder for Shekau with his Kanuri base to recruit the Fulani bandits in Northwest Nigeria. So like Usman Danfodio has relevance, but there's that sort of ethnic disconnect. And he never went as far in Takfir as Shekau has gone, or even as ISWAP has gone, even though he did declare Takfir.
All right. Another follow-on from that, are these actually Ansaru militants or members of local groups that have changed allegiances over time?
So you have a real mix. I mean, in northwestern Nigeria, you have sort of an indigenous, largely Fulani-led bandit movement that's accelerated in the past 5 years. And so what you have is an interesting interplay where Ansaru tried to revive itself after being dormant for 5 years, this year and last year, by integrating with the bandits. And so you have Ansaru and the bandits, and it's not easy to tell where one begins and the other. And I think they're having some difficulty recruiting the bandits to their ideological cause, because the bandits are not as much about forming a state, a jihadist state, but more about making money and criminality and getting revenge against the government. But you saw in Mali, in the past years, the success of jihadists in recruiting bandits to their cause and working together. We haven't quite seen that form, but that's what Ansaru is trying to do, and that's why Shekau and ISWAP are also trying to get involved there. But you're right, it's sort of a hodgepodge, and it's not clear that the jihadists have subsumed them.
All right, another question. I would like to ask how the this is not me, it's one of the listeners, ask how the territorial defeat of ISIS in Iraq and Syria affected the relationship between ISIS and Boko Haram, and how other jihadist groups are functioning in the sub-Saharan region after this developments in Iraq and Syria.
Yeah, so ISWAP, despite Baghdadi's loss, or his death, the group immediately declared loyalty to ISIS. And this is actually an important thing when you understand terrorist group organizational structure. Part of the reason why ISWAP underwent an internal coup in 2018 and became more hardline is because Islamic State, I argue in my book and elsewhere, Islamic State recognized the caliphate was probably going to fall. The ISWAP moderate leaders who had originally deposed Shekau were a little bit not too committed to ISIS. They were committed, but not too much. They also had history with Al-Qaeda. So part of the reason why Islamic State ordered the coup in 2018 was to get more committed leaders in ISWAP who are harder core, Takfiris even. And that is one reason why ISWAP's new leadership has remained so committed to ISIS despite the loss of al-Baghdadi, because ISIS helped shape the group so that it would remain committed. So the loss of Baghdadi and the caliphate has not affected ISWAP's loyalty to ISIS. It still keeps up a high attack momentum so that ISIS can keep claiming its attacks in West Africa. And I think for Shekau, he almost feels a little vindicated. Like he was kicked out of ISIS and ISIS lost his caliphate. He used to be bitter about it and complain in his statements. He doesn't complain about ISIS anymore. He still models his own group after ISIS in terms of his video productions, but he's just content being his own group again. But in general, you can say 2 years later, or 1 year later, al-Baghdadi's death has not really dampened ISIS influence in Africa. If anything, it's growing in Mozambique and Tanzania. It's still strong in Nigeria. And you had a surge of IS in Greater Sahara in the Sahel earlier this year, but they've actually been fighting Al-Qaeda and losing.
Okay, we have very little time left. Let me get you to focus on a few concrete yes, no, or short answers.
Sure.
One of the questions is that media is reporting increased kidnapping cases and village raids in northwestern states by bandits. Can any of these bandit members be considered part of a terrorist group, and would you classify these bandits as terrorists? From your previous comment, I think no, but just answer.
Yeah, I mean, they're not really terrorists. They don't really have political objectives, but the jihadists are trying to work with them in order to make them have political objectives.
Okay, next question. Can you briefly discuss how climate change has impacted recruiting for terrorist organizations in the region?
The quick point is climate change is quite negative for the economy. It's quite negative for vegetation. It's quite negative for employment. And all of that ends up helping the jihadists. They benefit from that.
And have they linked it to climate change, or are they just linked to the circumstances?
The jihadists don't use climate change or environmental degradation in their analysis.
Okay, thank you. How does Boko Haram feel about the Islamic movement in Nigeria, IMN, in the current situation? Competition, cooperation?
So this is a Shia movement, and the group did attack it in like 2015 and 2016, but they're generally in different operational areas. Abu Bakr Shekau, the leader of Boko Haram, he hates Shias, he hates Salafis who work with the government, he hates a lot of people. So the Shias are just one of several groups that they hate. But it's important to note that Muhammad Yusuf, the Boko Haram founder, was involved with the Shia movement before becoming a Salafi in 1995. So you can actually trace some of the essence of Boko Haram's early ideology to Shia Islamic revolutionary activism, although Muhammad Yusuf then took it towards a Salafi way from the mid-1990s onwards.
And the last question, if you're looking at the situation in the western states of Nigeria, who would you say is most influential? Ansaru, Boko Haram, ISIS West Africa? Is there equal influence or some much more influential?
It's a real competition between those three groups and just the bandit groups that are unaffiliated. I think Ansaru has an advantage in that it does have sort of a House of Fulani core, and it began operating in that region as early as 2012. I think ISWAP might have some certain advantages because the caliphate and ISIS is still an attractive narrative to a lot of Nigerians, so that might help it. Also, ISWAP has ties to ISGS, Islamic State Greater Sahara, which operates in Niger, Burkina, and Mali. So they might be able to link with their fellow colleagues in ISGS who are moving down towards the Nigerian border. That might help them. And there's a lot of trafficking and herding connections between northwestern Nigeria. And Shekau, he's trying to get involved in the Northwest. He's shown videos where he's got a lot of recruits. But we can say that that question is a key one. Northeastern Nigeria is in deep trouble. There's no sign of the conflict ending. Northwestern Nigeria is experiencing increased banditry at a time where, as we mentioned before, Nigeria's government is facing a crisis of legitimacy. Northwestern Nigeria has not really collapsed or anything like parts of Borno yet, but we do see very worrisome signs in terms of human security in the Northwest. And it's sort of up to you, various analysts out there, to try to get a read on whether ISWAP, Boko Haram, Ansaru, one of them or all three of them, will be able to succeed in northwestern Nigeria, and what that means for issues such as the criminal terrorism network, and what model will the jihadist groups try to use to subsume these banditry groups if they are able to. It's really a key thing. If you're looking not towards the past but towards the future, you really need to have your eyes on trends and data related to northwestern Nigeria.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob. You brought just incredible knowledge and insight into this topic, and it's all so incredibly useful, as you pointed out, to the people and needed by people working on this database. So thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. If anyone has any questions that didn't get answered, you can email me, no problem at all. Find me on Twitter at BokoWatch. And thank you so much, Louise, for helping to moderate and to stimulate the discussion and helping me out. And everyone,
they were so inspired by you. Thank you.
Right, thank you.